Thank you. Hi, everybody. Hope you had a good lunch. I'm Jeremy West. I lead the OECD's work on online safety. Sorry if you heard my panel talk earlier, but just in case you don't know what the OECD is, we're an intergovernmental organization of 38 countries. We provide policy advice and research to them on a range of social and economic issues, including internet governance. And we have about 3,500 people, lots and lots of economists and statisticians and lawyers like me. So with that out of the way, let me go to the next thing. Right. So how did we get started in the area of terrorist content online? That's not really traditionally an OECD thing. Well, in 2019, I was just putting the finishing touches on a book that's there on the left about online platforms. And then somebody decided to live stream a massacre of 51 people in Christchurch. And then shortly after that, there was another attack and another attack, all in 2019, all connected. Well, I'm talking only about the ones that were connected in one way or another with social media, like the attack in Halle, although I'm seeing that this slide is actually, I don't know how to fix this. It's only showing you part of it, so it's kind of cut off at the bottom. Sorry, it's supposed to be fully there. Maybe I make it a little small. There we go. Okay, that ought to do it. So what happened was the severity and the frequency of these attacks were so bad that policymakers' attention was definitely grabbed. And there were calls for action, like the Christchurch call, which came out, and then similar statements from the G7 and the G20, basically calling for governments and relevant companies to do something about it. And all of these calls for action had in common, among other things, that they said that there was a need for greater and better and more transparency from the platforms. So we at the OECD were asked what could we do to further the objectives in these calls for action. And the OECD is the kind of place where you try to have a pretty good base of evidence before you go out and say something or make recommendations. So the first thing that we wanted to do was to verify that actually there's a problem with transparency. And what we wound up doing, sorry, the previous slide showed that where we eventually got to was a voluntary transparency reporting framework for TVEC. That was the end game of what we were doing. But before we got there, we needed to make sure that there was a problem that needed to be fixed. So the way we did that was to examine the TVEC-related, terrorist and violent extremist content, TVEC-related policies of the top 50 biggest online content sharing services in the world, or I'll just call them platforms for short, even though they're not all traditional online platforms. And we put this evidence together about their policies and procedures and issued what we call a benchmarking report. What we did real quick was, first of all, to figure out who the top 50 were. And we did that based on monthly average users in most cases, and where we couldn't get that number, we based it on market share. And then for each one of these top 50, we created a standard profile. We checked the accuracy of the profiles with the profiled services, and then we made any necessary changes after that. So once the profiles were finalized, we compiled all the information in their standardized fields, to get our findings. And we discovered that while all 50 of the world's biggest platforms do prohibit TVEC with more or less clarity, varying degrees of clarity. As of the summer of 2020, when we issued our first transparent benchmarking report, only 5 of them issued transparency reports on TVEC. Also, we found that even among just that small group of 5 of the top 50 that issued transparency reports, they all went about it in a different way. They used different definitions of what terrorism was. They included different metrics in their reports. They issued the reports with different frequencies and on different timetables. So the result of, first of all, the rarity of the transparency reporting and the differences among them made it all but impossible to get an industry-wide picture of what was going on. How big is the scope of this problem? How is the industry as a whole doing in addressing it? And what's the impact on human rights of the steps that they're taking? It just wasn't possible with the information that they were providing. So after the first report came out, we thought, okay, there's definitely a problem here. We need to do something about this. We need to bring some sort of element of standardization to what's going on here. And we need to do something to make it easier or more appealing to engage in transparency reporting. But we also didn't stop our research on the benchmarking reports. We decided to do this annually so that we could start to put together a time series and see how these policies were evolving, especially the transparency reporting aspect of it. So a year later, the second benchmarking report came out, and there was some good news. The number of reporting firms more than doubled from 5 to 11. And some of the platforms that were already reporting added additional metrics to their reports. But most of the 6 ones that were new were very simple. So while it was great that they started doing this, they kind of had a long way to go to be really helpful. I'm not knocking them. Everybody has to start somewhere, and this is hard, especially for services that weren't used to doing transparency reports. There was still the problem that 11 isn't a very big number, and that the metrics were all different and the definitions were all different. That problem actually got worse with more reports, and the timetables weren't consistent. So the result was it was still hard to get an industry-wide perspective on what was going on. Then came the third year, which was last year, where we kind of hit our stride, and we had the methodology down for how we were doing this, but we also listened to feedback, and what we heard was, this is great, but just doing the top 50 isn't necessarily the right focus group. It would be great if you could also do this for the 50 services that actually are hosting and propagating the most TVEC. So we thought, okay, let's see what we can do about that. And that's how we got to this point. Now, I want to start. So in 2022, we did it 2 ways. We did it the 50 largest, and then the 50 most TVEC intensive ones. That's what I'll call the second group. And let me start with the findings from the first group, since that's what I've been talking about the previous 2 years. The trend continued. The number of firms that were issuing transparency reports, specifically on TVEC, jumped from 11 to 15. So that's terrific. But 15 is still clearly a minority out of 50. And I've shown this is I guess the opposite of naming and shaming. I've shown the names of the ones who issued transparency reports because this is a good thing. But then the same problems were still plaguing these transparency reports. And just to give you an idea, I've included this slide, which shows the different ways that they approached how they define TVEC and their terms and conditions. It's all different. The fonts are small, and don't try to read them all right now. I can summarize. Basically, there's a group that was really meticulous about defining the terms terrorism and terrorist content and violent extremist content. And then there was another group that explicitly banned the use of their technologies for terrorist content or violent extremist content, but they didn't really explain those terms with much clarity. Then there were ones that mixed TVEC with hate speech, which didn't make matters any easier when it came to looking at their empirical numbers, because you don't know what is it hate speech, or is it TVEC, or is it both? You don't know. And then there's some that kind of just say, yeah, we prohibit all illegal content on our platform. Thanks. That's really helpful, because then you can't even sort out TVEC from CSAM and other kinds of illegal content. So those were the kind of problems that we found. Now, I want to move quickly to the new feature of the latest report, which is the 50 intensive services. There is no publicly available, reliable data for this, as you all may know, or many of you may know. So what we did was we collaborated with a group called Site Intelligence. I want to give them a plug because they did great work. And it would take too long to explain their methodology, but basically it has to do with the fact that a lot of the bad stuff happens to be on a certain platform, and counting up scraping content and figuring out how many links are going to that platform for this kind of content. And that was the kind of heart of the methodology that they used to give us the information. And they did it in some subcategories that are listed here. And we found something pretty interesting. So only 11 of the services appear on both lists. Only 11. And they're listed there. So hold on to that fact as I take you to the rest of it. 13 of the intensive sites or services don't even prohibit TVEC, let alone report on it. Another 18 use those broad categories of supersets, so you can't sort out what's TVEC from what is the other type of prohibited content that they have. And only 8 report on TVEC, and 6 of those 8 are also on the other list. So what that means is only 2 of the smaller TVEC intensive platforms issue transparency reports. And I'm suggesting this might not be a coincidence, because a lot of them are actually run by terrorist or violent extremist sympathizer groups. So of course they're not going to issue transparency reports. Why does this matter? It matters because a lot of the policy discussions and even regulations that are emerging and have been going on about TVEC and violent extremist content focus mainly or even exclusively on the largest platforms. But because it's predominantly small and medium platforms that are actually the worst at propagating and hosting this stuff, the focus is maybe a bit misplaced and is inadvertently making things easier for the platforms that have the biggest problem. So hopefully I've blazed through that fast enough to leave time for some questions. I probably skipped something important. Sorry if I did, but maybe it'll come out in a question.
I think I can do it another way. Well, thank you you so much for being here. I was a part of the other session also. So I'll ask you a question relating to both the sessions, slightly loaded one. So, a terrorist for one country is a hero for the other. The governments are not ready to call them terrorists because as much as the push you can make, and then you have a UK list, a US list, Europe list, and what have you. You mentioned that you're also working with the governments. Is there a push from your side, your organization, to kind of bring them at the same level? I mean, we continue to talk about tech companies, and yes, they should do their part, but then lots of gaps within the government itself in terms of enforcing or looking at this. Along with that, when you say hate speech, if I look at National Action as an example, it's a terrorist organization that's classified, but then primarily what it does is provides hate speech. So there's an overlap also. And similarly with the other FTOs. So how would you suggest or guide us on those questions? Thank you.
So to answer the first question, the OECD is not getting in. I'm interpreting your question as, is the OECD doing anything to try to bring about convergence on how these terms are defined? Is that, yeah. No, we're not. And the reason we're not is because we were told very sharply when we started thinking about doing something in this area, don't do that. There are so many groups that are already working on that. The last thing we all need is another intergovernmental organization trying to define terrorism. So we said, okay, but we can't help but notice that you all have been at this for like decades and you haven't reached an agreement yet, but okay. I mean, we have to do what our member countries want us to do. And in this case, they didn't want us to go there. So all I can do is hope that they reach agreement. I mean, yeah, there are terrorist designation lists and so forth. But as I'm sure you know, they're terribly incomplete. They still tend to focus on Islamic extremists to the exclusion of far-right terrorists and so forth. And you're also right that sometimes governments designate their political enemies as terrorists just because they can. So yeah, that's messy. But you know what would really be helpful is governments deciding what a terrorist is one thing. But the way the terms and conditions of a lot of, at least the major platforms work is they say what they think it is. And the terms that they're going to enforce are. It would really help if they could at least agree among themselves what the heck it is that they're prohibiting. That would be helpful. So the second question was, I think, about how would I distinguish TVEC from hate speech?
Yeah, I mean, there's an overlap of extreme content vis-a-vis hate speech because some FTOs fall in the same category.
Yeah, and that's inevitable. There's always going to be some. But there's a difference between there being overlap and defining the two things like perfectly overlapping circles. Instead, it should be like a Venn diagram, like I had on one of my slides, actually. So yeah, there might be overlap, but it would be helpful for policymakers to know what the count of all the relevant metrics is under each category, even if there is some overlap.
Hi, Jeremy. Thank you. My name is Yulan. I've actually been on the other side of this. I was a data scientist on counterterrorism at Meta, and I produced some of those numbers, and it's tricky. But so aside from the policy definition, which is really hard and really depends on where the company is focused, what they believe in on their values, how would you imagine incentivizing companies to actually produce these numbers? And these are focused on TVEC, but like as a data scientist, I can say it's like for all the policies, it's not like necessarily a particular focus. So what's the incentive for companies to actually publish transparency reporting? I guess maybe some of the answer is regulations. And how will this information help make better decisions from your end?
Well, maybe I'll start with the end first because I want to make clear. The OECD isn't an organization that's going to start telling countries, how to go about formulating counterterrorism policies. It's not what we do. But one thing we do is to improve the evidence base so that they can make better policy decisions. multiple ways that companies could be motivated to issue transparency reports or issue better ones. Now the world has moved closer towards regulation, and so that's going to do a lot of the motivation. Unfortunately, it's proceeding in just the way we feared it would, and one of the reasons we undertook this work to try to standardize transparency reporting is because we saw that there was a regulatory wave coming, and that the countries were going to be likely to start issuing regulations in an uncoordinated way. And that's what they're doing. So for businesses, they're going from a world where they didn't have to issue transparency reports on TVEC or really any harmful or online content, to a world where not only do they have to do it, but they're going to have to do it multiple different ways every single reporting period. Doesn't really make sense. So we were trying to make it easier by creating a one-stop shop, so to speak, and then get consensus among the OECD member countries. We'll accept this template for transparency reporting. You don't have to do it 38 different ways. You can do it this one way and we'll all accept it. And actually, they did wind up supporting the template that we came up with, but that's the other part of this project. There's always a motivation for being a good corporate citizen, and that's what your former employer wanted to do, I think. And they're to be applauded for that. It's hard because they do that and then they get attacked because some journalist gets a hold of a number and says, oh God, why is there more TVEC on Facebook this year than last year? You guys aren't doing well. Well, and I know that they might have found more because they got better at detecting it. That's good, not bad. So those kind of problems can only be solved with better communication and kind of informing people how to read these things. Ultimately, the ultimate incentive is we've got a real world problem that's starting in many cases online and manifesting in the real world. And we're not going to really be sure from an evidence-based perspective on the best, most effective policies for dealing with that until we actually have a good evidence base, and we're just not there yet.
Thank you very much.